Good to be with you this morning on the Gallo Radio Show. It's been a lot of days on the radio. I've never been part of a program quite like the one that we have this morning, and it rolls on right now as we are remembering Paul Gallo, his life, his legacy, his time on the radio, and a lot of dear friendships that happened along the way. Former Governor Haley Barbour joins us this morning. Governor Barbour, always good to see you. I appreciate a few minutes of your time as we remember Paul Gallo this morning.
Well, a great man to remember. He was such a pathfinder in Mississippi. Well, at the same time, as Phil Bryant said earlier on your show, he was somebody we looked up to, somebody that made a difference. But at the same time, his ego was in check. He wasn't full of himself. He's good folks, and he did make a difference for Mississippi. I was elected governor in 2003 and went in 2004, but I had worked with him while I was Republican National Committee chairman in the 90s. And Phil was making the point that Paul was always very up to the facts. I mean, he knew what was going on, and but that applied to the national government too. I mean, when when Bill Clinton was president and I was national party chairman, we talk on the Gallo show about what was going on in Washington and, Hillary care and gun control and all the things that people in Mississippi did not approve of from Bill Clinton.
One of the things that has stood out is not everybody agreed with Paul. Sometimes people that were Republicans didn't agree with Paul, but especially on the other side. And yet he was able to find a way to a lot of times bridge that gap. And there ended up being mutual respect. We talked with Steve Holland earlier this morning. He said they didn't like each other. And then one day they realized, you know what, this is pretty good radio. And there was a respect and a friendship that grew out of that. And Paul had the ability to do that.
Well, he did. And, Steve was in the legislature when I was governor, but he and I went back to the 78 Cochran for Senate campaign, and when he was already in the legislature, but he lived in Tupelo. And I got to know him during that. And, Steve came home a lot harder than he really was. I mean, he wanted to show how tough he was. But at the end of the day, he was for doing what he thought was best for Mississippi. And sometimes we agreed. He's the guy that told me that we need to reform Medicaid, that there were a whole lot of people on Medicaid that had been allowed to be put on there. And the legislature voted for me to trim Medicaid. We took 60,000 people off the rolls and hardly noticed the difference. And Steve Holland deserves the credit for that.
Governor, I think one of the things that you and Paul have in common, Mississippi mattered a great deal to you. You came home from Washington, D.C., and ran for governor and had that 8-year run that was so impactful for the state of Mississippi. You cared deeply for your home state. That's one of the things that nobody can ever question about Paul. He loved Mississippi, and he wanted what was best for the state of Mississippi.
Well, there's no question about that. And I appreciate what you said about me. My family's been here on my daddy's side since right after the Civil War. And my mama's family were Choctaws. We were here to meet the boat. So we go back so far. I mean, my great-great-great-great-grandfather was Walter Leake, who was the third governor of Mississippi. And Leake County is named for him. And so I'm proud of that. I'm proud of being from Mississippi. I'm proud of my service to Mississippi. But this is to me, this is an easy place to want to help. Sometimes it isn't easy, to help, but it's an easy place to want to help. And lots of people showed that after Katrina. We had nearly 1 million volunteers who came to Mississippi in the first 5 years and registered with some church or some charity or some organization. Nearly 1 million people. And I think Mississippians ought to be proud of that they were somebody that people from all over the country came and helping people they didn't know. And all they could remember when they left is how everybody said thank you.
Visiting with former Governor Haley Barbour as we remember Paul Gallo this morning. Paul passed away on Sunday afternoon, surrounded by his family. Family is having a memorial service today, and then there's going to be a public service that we'll give you more details about coming up in the days to follow. Governor Barbour, I've asked or tried to ask each guest that we've had this morning if you could look a couple of years into the future, not in the present when we're trying to think about memories of Paul Gallo, but if you could look a couple of years into the future and Paul Gallo's name comes up, what do you think the first thing you would think of is when you hear his name?
He was the incredibly successful pioneer of talk radio in Mississippi, and did it in a way that he was able to do it for 30 years and still had a gigantic audience and still was somebody that you could turn on and expect to see some common sense displayed.
It's been interesting as we have visited with a number of people, elected officials, and I've asked the question a couple of times this morning because I had heard this in the past, but hearing the reaction to the idea that Paul had the ability to move votes or legitimately shape the conversation in the legislature, what was your experience with that?
Well, I heard Phil talking about that, and I think that's accurate. I mean, first of all, he had a lot of viewership. Second of all, in that viewership were a lot of legislators, but also there were a lot of politically active back in those legislators' districts who would hear that there was an effort to have tort reform like we did my first year. And they followed it on the Gallo show because candidly, it was the most honest, accurate thing that you had in the state. And I'm not being critical of newspapers and all that, but it was the place where you could turn it on and really understand what was going on. And maybe somebody else will do that. Social media has, tried to follow what people like Paul Gallo did, and I think they'll keep trying. I don't know whether they succeed, but I think they'll keep trying.
Certainly so. Governor, it's always a pleasure to visit with you. I want to have you soon. And just let you tell stories. It's one of my favorite things about getting to visit with you. There's so many incredible stories, and so many of those are about Mississippi, the work that you did, the work that others have done, and we thank you for your time this morning as we remember Paul.
You don't mind if I say hello to the
Thank you, Richard.
Governor Barbour, before I let you go, I just had a voice pop in my ear. There's someone that would like to say hello to you, and it's not the first time you've talked to him on the phone.
No, we've talked many times over the years.
I got Perez on the line. Can you hear him?
I can barely hear him, but I can close my eyes and see him. We had a lot of good times over the last 30 years.
There you go.
Beautiful. Governor, thank you so much for your time this morning. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Richard.
Governor Haley Barbour joining us on the Gallo Radio Show right here on SuperTalk, Mississippi. That's not the first time I've heard that voice in my ear either. Perez had a front row seat to the Gallo Radio Show for nearly 35 years. He's going to join us next. We'll talk with our friend. Good to hear Perez back behind a microphone as well. Quick timeout. We are remembering Paul Gallo this morning. As I said earlier, I thank you for all of the text messages. So many of those have come in this morning. My apologies for not being able to read all of them on the air, but I promise you we're reading them in the breaks, and it's so good to hear from all of you from all across the state of Mississippi. Gallo Radio Show. Perez joins me next as we continue on this Thursday morning, the 23rd of January, remembering the great Paul Gallo.